Hey guys, welcome back to another video today on Philosophical Inquiries, or as I used to be, Philosophus, keep changing the name. But sorry I haven't uploaded a video in like what, 10 days? Yeah, that's a pretty long time. I haven't been feeling the best lately, so forgive me on that part. And I am about to start school soon in about 3 days. Which really sucks because I really want to keep making these videos. This summer I've had a lot of time to read. I've read a lot and I've learned a lot. And so I'm appreciative of this summer, and I'm grateful for you, my viewers, my fans. I appreciate it. Thank you for watching these videos. I appreciate it so much. Um, Alright, let's get started into the video. So today I collapsed one of Coppin's sections in the brief textbook on mental philosophy and logic, probable reasoning and indirect reasoning, which are very fundamental things you have to grasp in logic and different methods of reasoning. Why? Because especially if you are going into a disputatio or a disputation, that is a debate, it might well be very, how would I say it? It might be very well useful for you to know these things in order for you to, don't have, to critique their arguments. But probable reasoning, not so much probably. But we'll see. Okay, so all the forms of argumentation we've talked about previously, like the syllogisms, which is a deductive argument following from two premises, which necessitates a conclusion. Now, a syllogism, their process is every way valid or reliable, and the conclusion, as I've said, necessitates or is getting necessitated from the premises, because remember, in a syllogism or any deductively valid argument, the premise is contained, the conclusion is implicitly contained in the premises. And the reasonings we've discussed or previously are called demonstrations or demonstrative. So that includes, the enthymeme, which is a syllogism which is an omitted premise, also known as a two proposition argument where there's an antecedent and a consequent. We've covered sorieties in the last video where that's a polysyllogism, and I taught you how to break them down, which is that, because they omit intermediate conclusions. But also that I've also taught you the epikyrema, and I also taught you the dilemma, which are very helpful, very useful forms of argumentation which you might like to use against your opponent, and that sort of stuff. Next, we're going to take a look at probable reasoning, which is different from demonstrative reasoning, or at least what a syllogism is, even though there is probable syllogisms, I believe. During my class, my teacher was talking about it. But probable reasoning doesn't remove all chances or fear of error. Now, let's make it clear. A syllogism can be probable. Yes, it can. And so, if a syllogism has at least one or two premises that are probable, the conclusion must likewise also be probable. Just like the rule that, if one of your premises is negative, then your conclusion has to be negative. If one of your premises is particular, then your conclusion has to be particular. And this is what we call dialectic, which just means open to discussion. Now, I believe in a probable, or you could say inductive syllogism, the conclusion is not contained in the premises, like how, in a demonstrative syllogism, which there is, the conclusion contained in the premises. As, for example, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, where the conclusion is contained in the premises, while in this case, probable reasoning does not have that. But namely, there are two species or two types of probable reasonings or syllogisms. One from analogy and two from hypothesis. These are the most commonly used in the natural sciences or physical science, like physics, chemistry, etc., etc. Oh, I just remember I took chemistry just not that long ago. So, I did do good. I got an A, so yeah. Let's start off with analogy. So, analogy, you might have heard it before, obviously. It's a very well common used word. Analogy is probable reasoning or an argument where we conclude a certain line of reasoning will hold in a particular case or one case because it is known to hold in a similar case. So, maybe you're, arguing with your friends. I believe analogy sometimes can be used as indirect reasoning in terms of like when you want to, how do I say it? When you want to ridicule your friend or ridicule your opponent, as you know, their claim or whatever they're arguing is just absurd. Analogy can also be used like that, but more of so it's probable reasoning. So like what I mean by indirect is like, for example, let's say they present a claim and then you're like, well, that's just analogous to this, which is absurd, and then you might say blah blah blah, which is a contradiction, absurdity, or whatever, etc. Um, but so, for example, because we see that smoke always follows fire in cases we know, then when we see smoke on a distant hill, we conclude by analogy that there is likely a fire there too. The principle that really undergirds analogical reasoning is that similar causes are apt to produce similar effects, which is a very, very debated statement right there, because as you've known in my prior videos, I covered David Hume. David Hume challenges this. Or similar properties suggest similar essences, or things similarly constructed appear to be governed by similar laws. This might also be known as induction as well. But yes, there are some probabilities that are strong and others that are weak and deceptive. But when they are deceptive, that means, devious, it might occur just because two cases differ on the central point in question. Now, the argument from analogy is really more useful to the orator than the philosopher, since the philosopher tends to use demonstrations more, right? When we're in metaphysics, we tend to use demonstrations. Why? Because they 100% guarantee the conclusion. The conclusion is 100% guaranteed. Although it's hard to find those premises which are, indubitable and, infallible in that sense. And arguments based on analogy are really more helpful for someone giving a persuasive speech, that is, orator, because they're not looking for, strict proofs in syllogistic form. They're not looking for you to present an enthymeme or a strict formal syllogism. Even though an enthymeme is kind of more of a rhetorical argument rather than a, strict demonstrative argument, it's still demonstrative though. But why? It's because analogy gives comparisons and examples, and it's actually an effective reasoning a majori, that is from the greater, and a minori from the smaller, and a pari from the equal. And in science, analogy usually suggests solutions that may be demonstrated, but until then, though, they are called hypotheses. So, although, they're possible to demonstration to be true, in the meantime, before they're demonstrated, until they become thesis, they are called hypotheses. Now, what is a hypothesis? You might have heard this a lot in your science class if you're taking chemistry or physics, because it is the start of every lab. So, for example, when I did chemistry at the start of every lab, I state my central claim or a hypothesis, which is a supposition or claim temporarily assumed to be true because it covers or accounts for a or many plausible facts. Although you do not provide the proof, because that's the whole point of the experiment, right? You do not provide the proof in the hypothesis. So, for example, a supposition or hypothesis might be the more salt you add onto a road, the higher the melting point of ice becomes, which is an actual phenomenon in chemistry. Now, when a hypothesis is so strongly evident or is confirmed by experience that it is true, and it excludes reasonable doubt about its truth or validity, it transforms into what we call a thesis. But what makes it probable and scientific? Now, Coppin says that it is necessary that it must explain a good portion of the facts in question, and two, it does not contradict any well-established facts, because if it does, it undermines the truth of it. And so we need to discuss what are contradictories. Contradictories are two statements that cannot both be true and cannot both be false. Necessarily one is true and the other false. For example, Socrates is sitting down, Socrates is not sitting down. And if we see that a hypothesis contradicts a well-established truth, we can say that it is false. And so that is why, right? Because a contradictory or a pair of contradictories cannot both be true nor both be false. One has to be false. If one is false, then necessarily the other one is true. Or if one is true, necessarily the other one is false. Next, let's take a look at indirect reasoning. Now, regardless if reasoning is probable or demonstrative, both can be indirect reasoning. When instead of trying to directly prove, when instead of trying to directly prove the thesis or central claim, it purports or it aims towards refuting or clearing away objections towards it, or by establishing another proposition from which the thesis can be inferred. There are many forms of indirect reasoning, which include the reductio ad absurdum or self-contradiction. This form of indirect reasoning shows that the negation or contradictory of the thesis leads to a contradiction or absurd consequences. I've seen a lot of people argue reductio ad absurdums informally sometimes. Sometimes they do it formally. Like, for example, if you saw my last video on syllogisms, I taught you guys how to interpret the Latin mnemonics and reduce syllogisms to first figure via reductio ad absurdum, or proof do the impossible, right? So really a reductio ad absurdum formally goes like this. So choose the conclusion or thesis you want to prove is true. First then, negate that conclusion, that is, state the contradictory, right? Because a pair of contradictories, only one can be true, the other necessarily has to be false. So if you choose the thesis you want to prove, you need to reason to a contradiction by first negating it and showing that that negation leads to a contradiction. Thus, you originally proved the original thesis. For example, we can prove that there is certainty necessarily by showing that the denial of any certainty leads to inconsistency or contradiction. So, thus, for example, actually, we just gave an example. I just forgot. But you can also do stuff like, you can use a reductio ad absurdum to refute universal skepticism, right? So, for example, universal skepticism is the theory that that neither affirms or nor denies anything, and then you could reason to a contradiction, or you can engage in a disputatio showing that it does that universal skepticism does in fact affirm a thesis, which therefore contradicts its own thesis. Secondly, the second form of indirect reasoning is the negative argument. This argument simply points out that opponents' assertions are without any proof, and the axioms that are received for the discussion are mere assertions mean nothing, and what is asserted without proof may be denied without proof. This is also known as a common principle, now coined by the late philosopher Christopher Hitchens, that this is Hitchens' razor, that what is asserted without proof may be denied without proof. So you might have heard of that a lot if you're in the debating community or whatever. And three, the instance or example, and this is basically using what Coppens calls a hypothetical case or a test case to show that an opponent's assertion or claim is flawed or inconsistent. So for example, let's say our opponent claims no woman is intelligent. We shall use a test case using Marie Curie, this is a genius woman in chemistry and physics, to disprove his claim, because Marie Curie was literally a genius, right? So if he says no woman is intelligent, we just use Marie Curie to disprove his claim, done. And it's false. Fourthly, which is pretty controversial, argumentum ad hominem. Now, an argumentum ad hominem uses an opponent's own belief to argue against them or his principles. So, for example, if a slave told a fatalist owner he couldn't be justly punished for theft since fate made him steal, and he really didn't choose, right? Because you don't have free will under fatalism. Now, ad hominem is usually taken, to be as a fallacy. But I think I must clarify, because in the logicallyfallacious.com, the ad hominem does have a slight thing to clarify. Ad hominem abusive, which is more of the fallacy that is used today. But now ad hominem really isn't a fallacy when you're considering in this case. So another ad hominem might be the tu quoque fallacy, as attacking the opponent instead of his argument. But to clarify what Coppens means here in the slave example, this case of ad hominem, it's not fallacious, because the slave uses the fatalist's own belief to show a contradiction, which targets the logic of the idea or his belief and not attacking the person making it a valid argument. So note in the definition of the fallacy of ad hominem, totally irrelevant, thus A valid example of the ad hominem fallacy is this. The theist is wrong about God's existence because he is so ugly and stupid. The fact that the theist is supposedly ugly or stupid has nothing to do whether his argument is true or not. That is a valid case of ad hominem, abusive. But in the case of argumentum ad hominem here, which Coppin states, this one merely attacks the opponent's belief in terms to showing it that it contradicts itself, or that it contradicts his principles, not him, right? So just clarifying on that. 5, a retort or retorsion flips an opponent's argument back on them. So for example, let's say an opponent says everyone should do whatever they want to do. Then we could retort and say, so what if someone wants to harm and kill you or others? Or we can also use the example, the fatalist owner or fatalist philosopher from the previous example. He could say, remember, because the slave told the fatalist owner, oh, I can't be punished because fate made me do it. And then the fatalist philosopher could just retort by saying, well, I was fated to punish you. So, that's funny. But yeah. 6, we have what we call evasion or evade. So when we evade an argument, when we avoid its proofs that the opponent gives, and instead we demand an explanation that the opponent can't or won't give, which often silences the opponent by challenging the consequences of their theory. 7, we have what we call ad ignorantium. This is when we use this to show that our opponent is unable to ground or prove his point or answer any of our objections. And 8, we have ad invidium, which is the argument that attacks an opponent's thesis or proofs by making them seem offensive or ridiculous. So, I think, for example, let me think of one, right? So let's say we could go back to the one about Marie Curie. No woman is intelligent, and then we could just make it seem like, oh, okay, so Marie Curie was intelligent, right? Offensive or ridiculous. Not fallacious exactly, but it could become fallacious. It depends on where you take it. So it is a form of indirect reasoning, though. So we just need to be careful on that. Now, whenever we are to answer objections from our opponents, we have to be careful to distinguish what is true from the false in our opponent's arguments. Most objections have truth to them because pure falsehood or falsity isn't convincing at all. Like, for example, if I said the moon is made out of cheese. Like, bro. Like, that's just pure falsity. And as Coppin beautifully says, truth blended with falsity is what gives plausibility to an objection or makes it convincing in a way. Now, the ability to distinguish what is true and what is false by clear lines of distinction is the most sharpest test of a person's logical skills, and this is the direct way to victory. And to help us accomplish such precise skill, we are going to, or Coppins is going to give us the general ways fallacious arguments occur, which I will cover the next video. Thank you for watching today, guys. Appreciate it. See you in the next video.